What lies beyond death? Is there justice for the wicked? What happens to our souls when we die? These are questions that haunted one of history's greatest poets, Dante Alighieri. But unlike most philosophers who merely thought about the afterlife, Dante claimed to have seen it with his own eyes. His journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise would become one of the most influential visions in human history, the Divine Comedy. But Dante wasn't just writing make-believe stories. In 1302, at the age of 37, his life fell apart in ways most of us can't imagine. He was kicked out of his beloved city, Florence, lost all his money and power, and was told he'd be burned alive if he ever tried to come home. Picture that, being told you can never go home again, and if you try, they'll kill you in the most painful way possible. This wasn't just some minor setback. Dante had been one of Florence's most important people. He was a politician, a literary genius, and came from a well-respected family. Now he was forced to wander from city to city, relying on the kindness of strangers to survive. From his early years, everyone thought Dante was headed for greatness in Florence. His family made sure he got the best education money could buy. He studied with the finest teachers and read every book he could get his hands on. But what really shaped his life was love. At just 9 years old, he met a girl named Beatrice, who would become his lifelong inspiration. Even though they barely spoke, and she later married someone else, Dante's love for her was so pure and powerful that she became his guide to understanding divine love itself. But Florence in the 1300s wasn't just some peaceful Italian city. It was more like a war zone. Two powerful groups, the Guelphs and Ghibellines, were constantly fighting for control. Think of it like a deadly game of musical chairs, where the losing side didn't just lose power, they lost everything. Dante was on the wrong side at the wrong time. When his enemies took over, they didn't just want him gone, they wanted him dead. This complete destruction of his life threw Dante into a crisis that went way beyond just losing his home and money. Everything he believed in was turned upside down. He had always thought that God's justice ruled the world, that good people would be rewarded and bad people punished. But here he was, a good man, a brilliant poet, someone who had served his city faithfully, being treated like a criminal while corrupt politicians lived in luxury. How could God allow such unfairness? Where was divine justice when wicked people prospered and honest ones suffered? These questions ate away at him, but instead of breaking him, they drove him to create something no one had ever attempted before, a complete map of the moral universe. He would show exactly how divine justice worked, from the deepest pits of hell to the highest reaches of paradise. This wasn't going to be just another religious story or moral lesson. Dante was about to create the most detailed, vivid, and terrifying picture of the afterlife ever written, one that would shape how people thought about good and evil for the next 700 years. This crisis point in Dante's life, this moment of total loss and confusion, was about to trigger one of the most remarkable journeys in human history. Not a physical journey through real places, but a journey through the landscape of the human soul itself. And what he found there would change literature, philosophy, and religion forever. In exile, Dante lived through his own personal hell. Try to imagine what it felt like, walking dusty roads between Italian cities, knocking on strangers' doors for food and shelter, all while knowing there was a death sentence waiting for you back home. But the physical hardships weren't even the worst part. For Dante, the real torture was in his mind. Before his exile, he had it all figured out. He believed in a world that made sense, where reason and faith worked together, where politics could create a just society, where God's plan was clear. Now, everywhere he looked, he saw corruption winning. Priests were selling church positions for gold. Leaders were betraying their own people. The Pope himself was playing political games instead of caring for souls. It felt like the whole moral structure of the world was falling apart. During his wanderings, Dante wrote letters home begging to be allowed to return. In one heartbreaking letter, he asked, "Is this how they repay my love for Florence?" He even offered to walk through the city like a shameful criminal, accepting public humiliation if they would just let him come home. But the answer was always the same: return and burn. This crushing reality drove Dante to question everything. In his political writings from this time, especially on monarchy, he poured out his frustration. He had once believed that a strong political system could create heaven on earth. Now he saw that human institutions were too corrupt, too easily twisted by greed and power. The same leaders who claimed to serve God were often the ones doing the devil's work. But here's where Dante's genius emerged. Instead of just complaining about corruption or writing angry political essays, he started seeing his personal crisis as part of something much bigger. His own journey from losing everything to finding a deeper truth began to feel like everyone's journey. His exile wasn't just from Florence, it was like humanity's exile from paradise. His wandering wasn't just physical, it was the wandering every soul does when trying to find its way back to God. Think about how he describes the moment his life fell apart in the Divine Comedy. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. He's talking about being 35 years old, midway through the average lifespan back then. But he's also talking about that moment when any of us realizes we've somehow lost our way in life. The forest he describes isn't just some bunch of trees. It's that terrifying place in your mind where nothing makes sense anymore, where everything you believed in seems like a lie, where you can't see the path forward or backward. Dante turned this personal moment of complete despair into something universal. His crisis became a starting point for exploring the biggest questions humans face. What makes a life worthwhile? How do we find meaning in suffering? What happens to justice in a corrupt world? This was the dark moment that had to come before Dante could begin his greatest work. Only by losing everything in the real world could he find the courage to imagine a journey through the afterlife. Only by experiencing injustice could he start to understand divine justice. His personal hell was about to become the gateway to understanding all of human sin and salvation. This is where Dante's genius really shined through. Instead of letting his pain destroy him, he turned it into one of the most incredible pieces of art ever created. The Divine Comedy starts with those famous lines we just talked about, but what follows is mind-blowing. A journey through hell so detailed, so vivid and so terrifying that people still have nightmares about it 700 years later. Picture this. Dante creates a hell that's like a massive funnel drilled into the earth, with 9 distinct circles going deeper and deeper. But here's the clever part. It's not just random torture chambers. Each level is designed to perfectly match different types of sins, getting worse as you go down. It's like Dante took all of human evil and organized it into the world's most terrifying filing system. In the upper circles, you find the sins that come from weakness, things like lust and gluttony. These sinners are punished, but not as harshly as those below. For example, in the circle of lust, souls are blown around forever by violent winds, just like they were blown about by their passions in life. It's painful, but there's a certain poetic justice to it. But as you go deeper, things get way darker. Dante puts corrupt politicians in a lake of boiling tar, literally swimming in the filth they created in life. Hypocrites have to walk forever wearing beautiful robes made of lead, crushed by the weight of their fake appearances. And get this, he actually puts real people here, including popes and politicians he knew personally. That's like making a movie today and putting current world leaders in hell. The man had serious guts. The deeper Dante goes, the more horrifying it gets. He saves the worst punishments for what he sees as the worst sins: betrayal and treachery. In the very bottom circle, he finds Satan himself, frozen in ice, chewing on history's 3 greatest traitors: Judas, who betrayed Jesus, and Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar. Why ice instead of fire? Because for Dante, betrayal is about having a cold heart, turning away from love, which he saw as the force that moves the universe. But here's what makes Dante's hell different from other religious visions of the time. It's terrifyingly logical. Each punishment isn't just torture. It's a perfect reflection of the sin itself. Greedy people who could never get enough in life, they're forced to push around huge bags of gold they can never spend. Fortune tellers who claim to see the future, their heads are twisted backwards so they can only see behind them. The punishment always fits the crime in a way that's both poetic and psychologically deep. Throughout this journey, Dante has a guide, the ancient Roman poet Virgil. This wasn't a random choice. Virgil represents human reason and wisdom, showing that understanding hell requires both imagination and logic. But Virgil can only take Dante so far. When it's time to enter paradise, Dante needs a new guide, Beatrice, the woman he loved, who represents divine love and grace. What makes this vision even more powerful is how personal it is. As Dante walks through hell, he meets people he knew in real life. He talks to old friends, political enemies, and famous historical figures. Each conversation reveals something about sin, justice, and human nature. Sometimes he feels pity for the damned souls, sometimes anger, and sometimes he even faints from the horror of what he sees. The whole journey is actually timed perfectly. Dante starts his descent into hell on Good Friday and emerges from paradise on Easter Sunday. It's a journey of death and rebirth, both for him personally and as a symbol for all humanity. This wasn't just some random choice of dates. Dante was showing that his personal crisis and redemption followed the same pattern as the biggest story in Christian faith. But Dante wasn't just writing a scary story. He was creating a complete system of understanding human behavior and its consequences. What makes his hell so fascinating isn't just the creative punishments, but how perfectly organized everything is. Unlike earlier religious visions that just showed random torture, Dante's hell is like a perfectly designed moral map. Take how he organizes sin, for instance. He doesn't just throw everyone in randomly. He creates a detailed system that still influences how we think about right and wrong today. At the top are sins of desire, things people do because they can't control their urges. These aren't great, but they're not the worst because at least they come from love, even if it's twisted love. Then come sins of anger and violence, worse because they actively hurt others. But the absolute worst, the sins of fraud and betrayal, because these require using our uniquely human gift of reason to deliberately harm others. Think about how modern this feels. We still tend to judge premeditated crimes more harshly than crimes of passion. We still see betrayal as worse than simple violence. Dante basically created a moral framework that we're still using 7 centuries later. But here's where it gets really interesting. Dante doesn't just punish people, he tries to understand them. Take the famous story of Paolo and Francesca in the circle of lust. They were real people who had an affair and were killed by Francesca's husband, who happened to be Paolo's brother. When Dante meets them, he doesn't just condemn them. He listens to their story and even faints from pity. It's like he's saying, yes, this is wrong, but I understand how it happened. He brings this same psychological insight to every level of hell. The suicides aren't just punished. They're turned into trees, showing how they rejected their human form. The flatterers are buried in human waste, physically surrounded by the metaphorical filth they spread in life. Each punishment reveals something deep about the nature of the sin itself. This wasn't just random creativity. Dante was combining multiple philosophical traditions. He took Aristotle's ideas about ethics, mixed them with Christian theology, and added his own political understanding. The result was something totally new, a complete theory of human behavior and its consequences. For example, he places violence against others, violence against self, and violence against God in different circles, showing how he understood that not all harmful acts are equal. He puts corrupt politicians deeper in hell than murderers, arguing that betraying public trust is actually worse than individual violence because it harms entire communities. But perhaps his most revolutionary idea was about free will. In Dante's view, everyone in hell chose to be there through their own actions. That's why the gate of hell has that famous inscription, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." It's not just about punishment, it's about the natural consequences of our choices. If you consistently choose to turn away from love and truth, you'll eventually find yourself unable to turn back. This is why his masterpiece isn't just called Hell or The Afterlife, it's called The Divine Comedy. Because for Dante, the whole universe operates according to perfect justice. What looks like tragedy from our limited human perspective is actually part of a larger pattern of divine justice. Every sin carries its own punishment, every virtue its own reward. Through writing The Divine Comedy, Dante discovered something far more powerful than earthly justice. What started as a response to his personal tragedy became something universal, a complete map of the human soul. When he began writing, he was just an exiled poet looking for meaning in his suffering. By the end, he had created something that would change how people think about good and evil forever. But here's what's really fascinating. As Dante wrote his way through hell, purgatory, and paradise, he wasn't just describing these places. He was working through his own transformation. When he started, he was full of anger at his enemies, putting many of them in hell with vicious punishments. But by the time he reached paradise, he had moved beyond personal revenge to understand something deeper about love and forgiveness. Take, for example, how he changes as he moves upward. In hell, he's often angry and judgmental. In purgatory, he starts to understand the possibility of redemption. By paradise, he's focused entirely on divine love. It's like watching someone grow from wanting revenge to understanding forgiveness in real time. The impact of his work was immediate and has never really stopped. Artists like Botticelli and William Blake created stunning illustrations of his hell. Writers from Chaucer to T.S. Eliot have borrowed his ideas. Even modern video games and movies still use his vision of hell as inspiration. The idea of hell having different levels? That's Dante. The image of Satan frozen in ice? Dante again. The whole concept of punishment fitting the crime in the afterlife? You guessed it, Dante. But his influence goes way beyond just art and literature. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in Italian instead of Latin, a revolutionary choice that helped create the modern Italian language. It would be like if someone today wrote a masterpiece in text message language, and it was so good it changed how everyone wrote. He showed that profound ideas could be expressed in everyday language that regular people could understand. More than that, he changed how we think about the relationship between God and humans. Earlier religious writers usually just warned people about sin and punishment. Dante created a complete picture of how human actions connect to their consequences, both in this life and beyond. He showed that divine justice isn't just about punishment, it's about understanding the true nature of our choices. In the end, Dante never did return to Florence alive. He died in exile in Ravenna in 1321, still dreaming of his beloved home city. But his exile gave us something far greater than any political career could have. By losing everything, he gained the freedom to write exactly what he thought about power, corruption, love, and justice. His personal tragedy became humanity's treasure. Today, centuries later, when someone talks about going through hell, they're often unknowingly quoting Dante. When we say someone's actions have come back to haunt them, we're thinking like Dante. His vision of justice, where every action has its perfect consequence, has become part of how we understand right and wrong. Not bad for a man who lost everything and turned his suffering into art that would last forever. Let me write the closing section now. Think about this. A man who lost everything, who was forced to wander as a stranger in his own country, ended up creating something that would last for centuries. Dante died in exile in Ravenna on September 14, 1321, never seeing his beloved Florence again. He was 56 years old. But Florence, the city that rejected him, would later deeply regret their decision. They repeatedly tried to get his remains back, but Ravenna refused to return them. Even today, there's an empty tomb in Florence's Santa Croce church, still waiting for Dante's body. It's like a 700-year-old apology written in stone, in a twist that Dante himself might have appreciated as divine justice. His death mask became one of Florence's most treasured possessions. The same city that threatened to burn him alive now proudly displays his face. His home has been turned into a museum. The places that once banned him now celebrate him as their greatest son. Maybe the most powerful part of Dante's story isn't what he saw in his vision of hell, but what he proved with his life. That sometimes losing everything isn't the end. Sometimes it's just the beginning. That even in our darkest moments, when we feel most lost in that forest dark, we might be on the verge of creating something incredible. Dante took his personal pain and turned it into a universal story. He faced exile and turned it into a journey through the afterlife. He confronted corruption and created a perfect system of divine justice. He lost his political power but gained immortality through his words. His story shows us that sometimes the greatest visions come from the deepest darkness, and that true justice, while it might not come in this life, finds its way in the end. The inscription on his tomb in Ravenna reads, "Here lies Dante, exiled from his homeland." But perhaps a better epitaph would be the words he himself wrote. "The path to paradise begins in hell." After all, that's exactly what happened to him. His personal hell became the world's paradise.